The city was a symphony of indifference, a relentless hum that underscored Arthur's profound stillness. Each morning, the same ritual. He'd wake to the gray light filtering through the blinds of his small apartment, the air thick with the dust of unfulfilled intentions. The title of his life, if he were to give it one, would be The Man Who Couldn't Move On. It echoed the hollow ache in his chest, the constant companion. He moved to the bathroom, his gaze drawn to the cracked mirror above the sink. A spiderweb of fractures marred the glass, each line a silent testament to a past frustration, a moment when the reflection staring back had been too much to bear. Now he barely registered the damage. It was just there, like the lingering scent of old coffee, or the persistent feeling that he was perpetually on the cusp of something, yet never quite reaching it. Arthur stripped down, his eyes tracing the familiar landscape of his own body. Not a body of neglect, but one of quiet discipline. He'd started the exercises months ago, a desperate attempt to outrun the inertia that had claimed his spirit. Push-ups until his muscles burned, planks until his core trembled, each repetition a futile prayer against the invisible chains that bound him. He saw the definition in his arms, the tightening of his core, but the man in the mirror remained unchanged. The physical transformation was a cruel joke, a vibrant shell around a stagnant core. He remembered the words of a forgotten philosopher, something about the soul being a restless sea, always seeking its shore. Arthur's sea was becalmed, a vast flat expanse under a perpetually overcast sky. He felt the weight of expectations, not from others, but from the ghost of the man he used to be, the one who had plans, who believed in forward momentum. That man was gone, replaced by this quiet, methodical automaton, performing the motions of life without truly living. This feeling, this profound inability to move, wasn't just a lack of motivation. It was a deep-seated paralysis, a catabasis, not into a mythical underworld, but into the mundane hell of his own inaction. He was stuck in a loop, observing his own life from a distance, a prisoner of his own mind. The world outside, vibrant and chaotic, seemed to mock his internal stagnation. He knew, intellectually, that he needed to break free, to find a new path, but the how remained an impenetrable fog. If you've ever felt this profound sense of being stuck, of watching life pass you by while you remain rooted to the spot, then you understand Arthur's silent struggle. This journey, exploring the insights of Jung and St. Augustine, might just offer a different kind of mirror, one that reflects not just the brokenness, but the potential for profound transformation. Join us as we delve deeper into Arthur's story and the timeless wisdom that can help us all find our way out of the stillness. Consider subscribing to follow this series and explore how ancient wisdom can illuminate modern struggles. Arthur finished his morning routine, the familiar ache in his muscles a dull counterpoint to the sharper, more persistent ache in his soul. He dressed mechanically, each movement a practiced gesture devoid of enthusiasm. The city outside began its daily crescendo, a symphony of honking taxis and distant sirens, but Arthur remained insulated, a silent observer in his own life. He often wondered if anyone else felt this way, this profound disconnect between the vibrant world and the muted landscape of their inner self. The concept of catabasis, the descent into the underworld, resonated deeply with him, though his underworld was not one of mythical beasts or fiery pits. but a labyrinth of unfulfilled potential and gnawing regret. He recognized the pattern described by ancient myths, the hero forced to confront what he had long avoided. For Arthur, this confrontation was with the ghost of his past ambitions, the dreams that had once burned so brightly, now reduced to embers. He saw the persona Jung spoke of, the mask he presented to the world, a competent, if quiet professional, slowly cracking under the strain of his internal stagnation. He walked to the small cafe on the corner, the aroma of coffee and pastries a fleeting comfort. As he sat, stirring his black coffee, his mind drifted to the words of St. Augustine, a man who, centuries ago, grappled with his own profound restlessness. Augustine's struggle with dispersion interior, the fragmentation of the soul into multiple desires, felt eerily familiar. Arthur, too, had chased fleeting pleasures, not in the same sensual way as Augustine, but in a relentless pursuit of external validation, career milestones, fleeting relationships, the illusion of control. Each pursuit had left him emptier than before, a temporary balm over a deeper wound. Augustine's famous prayer, "Give me chastity and continence, but not yet," echoed in Arthur's mind. It wasn't chastity he craved, but change, a radical shift in his existence. Yet, like Augustine, he found himself saying, "Not yet." He knew what he needed to do: confront the fears that kept him tethered, dismantle the comfortable narratives he'd built around his inaction. But the thought of taking that irreversible step, of shattering the last vestiges of his old identity, was terrifying. It was easier to remain in the familiar discomfort of his catabasis than to face the unknown territory of true transformation. He looked out the window, watching the hurried footsteps of strangers. Each person seemed to have a destination, a purpose. Arthur felt like a ship without a rudder, adrift in a sea of purpose. The shadow Jung described, the repressed parts of his personality, felt like a heavy cloak he couldn't shed. He knew there were impulses, resentments, and fragilities hidden beneath his calm exterior, aspects of himself he had long denied, but acknowledging them, truly seeing them, felt like opening Pandora's box. The cafe buzzed with life, a stark contrast to the silence within him. He longed for the light of certainty that Augustine found, the sudden illumination that dispelled all doubt. But for Arthur, the path remained obscured, shrouded in the mists of his own making. He was at the precipice of a choice: to continue his quiet descent, or to finally, truly, begin the arduous climb back towards himself. The question was not if he could, but if he dared. The "not yet" that plagued Arthur was a heavy anchor, dragging him deeper into the murky waters of his own psyche. He spent his afternoons in the city library, not seeking answers in self-help books, but in the dense, often challenging texts of Jung and Augustine. He was searching for a language to describe his internal landscape, a map to navigate the wilderness of his soul. The words of these ancient and modern thinkers offered a strange comfort, a confirmation that his struggle was not unique, but a universal human experience. Jung's concept of the shadow became increasingly vivid to Arthur. It wasn't just a theoretical construct. It was a palpable presence within him. He began to notice the subtle ways his repressed fears and unacknowledged desires manifested. A sudden surge of irritation at a stranger's laughter, a pang of envy at a colleague's success, a deep-seated resistance to any suggestion of change. These were the whispers of his shadow, demanding recognition. He realized that much of his life had been an unconscious attempt to avoid these internal truths, to maintain a comfortable, if ultimately false, image of himself. He recalled Jung's own confrontation with his unconscious after his break with Freud, a period of profound disorientation that forced him to turn inward. Jung's deliberate engagement with his dreams, fantasies, and visions, even the terrifying ones, struck Arthur as an act of immense courage. Could he, too, face the unsettling images that emerged from his own depths? He wasn't seeing apocalyptic visions of Europe, but he was experiencing a persistent sense of dread, a feeling that something vital was missing, something he had lost or never truly possessed. One evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, the silence pressed in on him. He picked up a worn copy of Augustine's Confessions, his finger tracing the lines where Augustine described his moment of crisis in the garden, hearing the child's voice. Tolle, lege, take up and read. Arthur yearned for such a clear, unambiguous sign, a divine intervention to cut through his paralysis. But his world offered no such dramatic pronouncements, only the relentless drone of the city and the quiet despair of his own thoughts. Yet, Augustine's subsequent act, opening the scriptures and reading the first passage his eyes fell upon, resonated with a different kind of power. It wasn't just the external voice, but the internal willingness to act on it, to interpret it as a divine command. It was a moment of radical acceptance, a surrender to a truth greater than his own conflicted desires. Arthur wondered if his own take up and read moment might not come from an external voice, but from a deeper part of himself, a part he had long ignored. He closed the book, the weight of it in his hands a tangible reminder of the centuries of human struggle for meaning. The idea that his catabasis was not merely a personal failing, but an archetypal pattern, a necessary descent for growth, began to shift his perspective. It didn't make the pain disappear, but it reframed it, giving it a purpose beyond mere suffering. He was not just stuck. He was in a process, a difficult, uncomfortable, but potentially transformative process. The question remained, would he, like Jung, dare to be his own experiment, or would he continue to resist the emergence of his own shadow, prolonging his stay in the underworld of inaction? The answer, he knew, lay not in more reading, but in a single, decisive act. The weight of the not yet had become unbearable. Arthur's quiet routine, once a shield against chaos, now felt like a cage. The intellectual understanding of Jung's shadow and Augustine's fragmented soul was no longer enough. He needed an experience, a visceral shift. He realized that his endless reading, his solitary exercises, were still forms of avoidance, sophisticated distractions from the true work of confronting his inner world. He was circling the perimeter of his own catabasis, afraid to step into its core. One afternoon, a peculiar incident occurred. As he walked past a construction site, a sudden gust of wind dislodged a loose sheet of metal from a scaffolding. It clattered to the ground just inches from his feet, a jarring metallic shriek that ripped through the city's hum. For a split second, time seemed to slow. He saw the metal falling, felt the rush of air, and then the impact. The near miss wasn't terrifying in the way a direct threat might be. Instead, it was a profound jolt, a sudden, stark reminder of the fragility of existence and the preciousness of the life he was letting slip by. It was a moment of clarity, not a divine voice, but a raw, undeniable confrontation with his own mortality and the inertia that had consumed him. It was as if the universe had screamed, "Wake up!" In that instant, the comfortable narratives he had built around his stagnation began to crumble. The fear of change, the attachment to his old, unfulfilled identity, suddenly seemed less daunting than the prospect of continuing this half-life. He thought of Jung's observation that the persona, the social mask, must crack for the shadow to emerge and for true individuation to begin. His near accident felt like a violent crack in his own persona, forcing him to acknowledge the raw, unadulterated fear and desire for life that lay beneath. He had been living as if he had an infinite supply of tomorrows, but the clatter of that metal had shattered that illusion. That evening, Arthur didn't go to the library. He didn't perform his usual exercises. Instead, he sat in his apartment, the silence no longer oppressive, but expectant. He picked up a pen and a blank notebook, something he hadn't done in years. He began to write, not about philosophy or psychology, but about the raw, unfiltered emotions that had been simmering beneath the surface. His anger at himself, his grief for lost opportunities, his desperate longing for connection, his fear of failure, and surprisingly, a flicker of hope. This act of writing was his own toll lege, his own descent into the subconscious punitive that Augustine described. He wasn't reading ancient texts. He was writing his own, excavating the buried contents of his personal unconscious. It was messy, uncomfortable, and deeply unsettling. He recognized the pulsões corrompidas that the base script mentioned, not as mythical beasts, but as his own tendencies towards self-sabotage, isolation, and the relentless pursuit of superficial comforts. As he wrote, he felt a strange sense of release, a tension he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but a quiet, internal shift. He wasn't yet out of the woods, but he had taken the first terrifying step away from the stagnant pool of his inaction. He was no longer just observing his life. He was beginning to participate in its messy, unpredictable unfolding. The path ahead was still unseen, but for the first time in a long time, Arthur felt a faint stirring of genuine curiosity about where it might lead. He was finally beginning to move. The act of writing, raw and unedited, became Arthur's anchor. Each word was a small victory against the inertia that had defined him. He wasn't crafting elegant prose. He was simply emptying the contents of his mind onto the page, confronting the shadow in its most intimate form. The fears, resentments, and unacknowledged desires that Jung spoke of were no longer abstract concepts. They were tangible entities he was finally allowing himself to see. This was his personal AIDS, not a place of the dead, but a space where the forgotten parts of himself lay waiting. He began to notice subtle changes. The cracked mirror in his bathroom still showed the same reflection, but his gaze lingered differently. He saw not just the physical form, but the quiet strength in his eyes, a nascent determination that had been absent for too long. His morning exercises, once a desperate attempt to outrun his inner turmoil, now felt like a grounding ritual, a way to connect with the body and the present moment. The physical discipline was no longer a substitute for inner work, but a complement to it. The wisdom of Jung and Augustine, once confined to the pages of books, began to integrate into his lived experience. He understood Augustine's journey from dispersion interior to a new spiritual center, not as a religious conversion, but as a recentering of the self around an authentic core. Arthur realized he had been living for external expectations, for a persona that no longer served him. Now he was slowly, painstakingly building a life from the inside out. Jung's idea that no hero returns from catabasis, the same person, resonated deeply. Arthur wasn't a hero in the mythical sense, but he was undergoing his own transformation. The old identity, the man who couldn't move on, was dissolving, making space for something new. He didn't have all the answers, and the path ahead was still uncertain, but the profound sense of stagnation had lifted. He was no longer paralyzed. He was in motion, even if that motion was sometimes hesitant. He started small, a conversation with a neighbor he'd always avoided, a walk in a different part of the city, simply to observe and be present. He even considered reaching out to an old friend, a thought that would have been unthinkable weeks ago. These were not grand gestures, but they were significant steps, each one a testament to the internal shift that had occurred. He was learning to live with a level of honesty, both with himself and with the world, that he hadn't thought possible. The light of certainty that Augustine found wasn't a sudden flash for Arthur, but a gradual dawn. It was the quiet confidence that came from confronting his own darkness, from recognizing his shadow, and from choosing to engage with life rather than retreat from it. He understood that suffering was not eliminated, but his relationship to it had changed. As Jung observed, the darkness was not the end, but a necessary part of the journey, a fertile ground for growth. Arthur still had moments of doubt, days when the old inertia threatened to creep back in. But now he had tools, a deeper understanding of himself, and the courage to face what emerged. He was no longer the man who couldn't move on. He was a man moving, slowly but surely, towards a more integrated and authentic self. His journey was a testament to the enduring power of introspection, the courage to face one's inner demons, and the timeless wisdom that reminds us that even from the deepest catabasis, a new life can emerge. The shattered mirror in his bathroom remained, a permanent reminder of where he had been. But now, when he looked into it, he saw not just the cracks, but the reflection of a man who had dared to descend into his own underworld and was slowly, powerfully, finding his way back to the light.